one of my favorite music genres is hip-hop. And I like hip-hop because it has a great beat, but mostly I like hip-hop because it has some really interesting lyrics. And I think lyrics that have gone unexplored in the classroom in many ways. So hip-hop is not uncontroversial to use in the classroom. Why? Because sometimes it can be misogynist, and sometimes it can abuse certain forms and rhythms of music and our peoples. It can be very tough to listen to. It can be very, and can use language that's very difficult. That's why I like to use resistance hip-hop, what I call resistance hip-hop. This is not something that's, has been theoretically developed. It's just a term that I've made up for the type of hip-hop that I think we can use in the classroom that stays a little more conservative when it comes to its use of language and women. A lot of the hip-hop that I'm using this year is going to come out of the Middle East and Africa. And so what I wanted to do before we use hip-hop and I wanted to think through what it is, why we're using it, and then kind of launch ourselves into using it. So what I wanted to do is show you it's a 10-minute video of a friend and a colleague. His name is Josef Sorett. He's a professor of hip-hop at Columbia University in New York City. And he spoke at the conference that took up hip-hop that I went to, that I was telling you about last week. And he explains to us what hip-hop is. It gives us a quick little intro to it, so we have an orientation of what it is, what we're using, and what we're doing in this class. Okay, so any questions on that? No? All right. So let's go to the video.
I have been tasked with the responsibility of providing some type of social historical context to the origins of hip-hop here in the United States, the American story as we open it to a broader conversation around Africa and the Middle East and global hip-hop. And so my title for our conversation, and I would invite you, I will, alongside of my comments, have some clips and some images, invite you to stop me where I'm not clear, but I have assumed a relative, I've been asked also to be functioning in capacity somewhat as a hip-hop 101, so I don't assume a certain working knowledge, but if I talk as though I am assuming a certain knowledge, please stop me so that we can have the conversation that Paul and Ben hope for the day. But title, as you see here, is from Margins in Mainstream's Hip-Hop's Roots and Routes, or Roots and Roots, if you will. And what I've tried to do, as Ben has even mentioned in his introduction, is to think about the relationship of hip-hop to the market, hip-hop as local forces, emerging as grassroots efforts, is to hold those things simultaneously alongside of each other, right? And so what you have here are two album covers associated with hip-hop's earliest years here, both associated with groups in the New York City area. The first commercially produced CD, Rapper's Delight, by the Sugar Hill Gang, actually produced across the George Washington Bridge in Inglewood Cliffs at Sugar Hill Records, the kind of image of hip-hop entering the mainstream, right? The story of it, first crossover moment that, depending on what your politics are, it's a moment of decline from grassroots resistance or a moment of arrival as a form of American popular culture. And what I hope to do by juxtaposing Sugar Hill with Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, their first album, and the title track, The Message, and I have that queued up as I'm figuring out, is to hold the idea of hip-hop as a form of resistance to the mainstream, but hip-hop also as now arguably the most popular form of global culture around, hold hip-hop at the center of the market as a place for conversation. So the figures that you'll see throughout, interspersed throughout the PowerPoint that I have and throughout my conversation are in fact often some of the most mainstream figures, right? And which is to say that when we neglect the stories that they're telling and the subtleties, that we also miss part of the picture. And so we have Rapper's Delight alongside of the message, and why don't we skip to those clips to give two different images of hip-hop as party music and hip-hop as, if you will, message music or source of social critique. Here we go. So we'll start actually with Rapper's Delight, 1979.
The Sugar Hill Gang.
The hip, how you don't stop. Rock it out, baby, rubber to the boogity bang bang, the boogie to the boogity beat. Now what you hear is not a test. I'm rapping to the beat, and me, the groove, and my friends are gonna try to move your feet. You see, I am Wonder Mike, and I'd like to say hello. Up to the black, to the white, the red, and the brown, and the purple, and yellow. But first, I gotta bang, bang, the boogie to the boogie. Say up, jump the boogie to the bang, bang, boogie. Let's rock. You don't stop, rock the rhythm that'll make your body rock. Well, so far, you heard my voice, but I brought two friends along.
Now, I assume most of you have heard, if not the original, I think, was it Snoop who did a remix, kind of reimagined version of Rapper's Delight. So no, this is not new to anybody, right? But this clearly is an early moment of hip-hop as party music, as about a celebration. Even the yellow, brown, black, and the white kind of move that in some ways is not the story that folks tell when they invoke hip-hop as a source of kind of cultural unity and diversity, but we can see here hip-hop as the center of a party, right? And even its influences in 1970s New York disco scene, right? That's not often the story we tell about hip-hop. And then arguably the more popular story is one of hip-hop as a source of oppositional culture, hip-hop as a source of resistance. And the message serves as an early instance of this.
It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
Broken glass everywhere, people pissing on the stage, you know they just don't care. I can't take the smell, can't take the noise, got no money to move out, I guess I got no choice. Rats in the front room, roaches in the back, junkies in the alley with the baseball bat. I tried to get away, but I couldn't get far, cause a man with a touch truck repossessed my car. Don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under. Standing on the front stoop, hanging out the window, watching all the cars go by, roaring as the breezes blow. Crazy lady living in a bag, eating out of garbage pails, used to be a fag hag, such a dance to tango, skipped the life and tango, a zircon princess, seemed to lost her senses. Down at the peep show, watching all the creeps, so she could tell her stories to the girls back home. She went to the city and got so did it, she had to get a pimp, she couldn't make it on her own.
And so as we think about hip-hop both as responding to the mainstream but also representing the mainstream, I want to think about this idea of I am hip-hop, and what we might throw around are a number of definitions of hip-hop, and when using the language of I am hip-hop, borrowing from one of these early rappers who I'll say more about, actually I should be true to his language, an MC as opposed to a rapper, right? Even something is up for grabs in whether you define yourself as an MC or a rapper. But in this definition from KRS-One of I am hip-hop, points to the idea of hip-hop as not simply a music, not simply lyrics, not simply a dance, what have you, but who you are. I am versus who you are versus what you do. And so perhaps it's fitting, and even in hip-hop scholarship that Ben mentions too, that I begin with, in some regards, my own story of entrance, right? So in recent years, there's these ideas of falling in love or in and out of love with hip-hop, as popularized in this movie Brown Sugar. And so in my own kind of scholar of religion process, and with religious background, I had my fall out of love with hip-hop experience, right, where Often this happens when we see the misogyny and the sexism. Those of us in academic programs don't want to deal with that stuff, right? And we recognize the challenges that hip-hop represents and its complexities. And so I actually come back to hip-hop after leaving, if you will, in the 80s, late 80s and early 90s, post-college, working with young people in the Boston area, right? In religious institutions and community-based organizations where hip-hop then becomes a way of a shared language. So through Tribe Called Quest, through Roots, through Common, in this early burgeoning conscious hip-hop scene as its own genre, that becomes a language for me to connect with the young people that I'm in conversation with about any number of issues, right? So hip-hop, not just as a site of entertainment, as my third point mentions, but also as a kind of education tool, right? A shared language or literacy that one allows us, and then perhaps in some regards that's the motivation for bringing educators into a conversation about hip-hop in its global context. So when we think about a definition of hip-hop, we want to hold alongside questions of aesthetics or music, culture, questions of identity, and questions of history. And so when one says hip-hop, I am hip-hop, in its kind of worst sense, it could be an effort to kind of contain cultural property. This is mine and you can't speak about it. It's kind of litmus test for who owns hip-hop and who doesn't, right? But as a broader sense, we can look at it in another sense of hip-hop as being something that we all have a stake in, right? It's not just the story of a particular group of young people. As it has circled around the globe, it is something that we all, as global citizens wrestling with the forces of globalization, have stake in. And when we think of hip-hop both as education and entertainment, we think of course, again, KRS-One, right? And this idea of edutainment, with many hip-hop artists seeing hip-hop as a strategy for teaching. What I want to do in the next, I guess, 30 to 40 minutes is think about hip-hop in 4 different ways, right? First, hip-hop itself is perhaps the subject of a history course, right? It could be a history course, post-civil rights America, right? 60s to the present. Second, we might think about hip-hop as itself a form of resounding the standing narratives, right? Bringing other voices to the narratives of American history, of global history, as Ben puts on the table, youth culture, right? And how youth voices are often not a part of the standard textbooks. As I've mentioned already, thinking about hip-hop not simply as culture, but also as commodity, right? Rather than thinking about those two things as mutually exclusive. And then finally, as a way of transitioning into the remaining conversations that you'll have throughout the workshop, thinking about hip-hop and globalization.
All right. So he calls, Professor Sorett makes a distinction between message music and party music, right? So what did you understand from party music? What was that? Yes, and tell us your name. Yeah, exactly. It's fun music. It's got a good beat, it's got a good rhythm. That's right. It's, but it doesn't, it might not have kind of the core kernel that we're going to be looking for. And so what about message music? Anyone? What's message music? Yes? Corey?
It's music that has a social or political message.
Right. So that's what I'm going to be talking about, is that message music, or what I'm going to call resistance hip hop in particular. So when we're listening to this, when we're listening to hip hop throughout this year, just remember that we're aware of some of the problems with hip hop, the misogyny, the objectification of women and men, and some of the language that's very problematic amongst some of the hip hop artists and rappers that we have out there today. So we're going to be looking at mostly hip hop from the Middle East and Africa. So I just want to keep those disclaimers in mind.